Opens central lines, immediately contesting the kingdom's heart and preparing for a swift development of powerful pieces toward the battlefield. Immediately contesting central influence, knight develops with tempo, preparing further development and potential pawn breaks. Developing the knight to f3 elegantly reinforces the central pawn and prepares for castling, a fundamental step in securing the king. Embracing fianchetto, black prepares long-range influence on the dark squares, a common strategic choice against d4 openings aiming for flexible development. Solidifying the center and preparing to challenge black's fianchettoed bishop while aiming for queenside space. Developing the bishop to its most natural diagonal solidifies black's fianchetto structure and prepares for queenside counterplay. Solidifying the center while preparing for pawn advances or piece development, setting a flexible foundation. Safely tucking the king away establishes a secure base, paving the way for future piece development and central pawn breaks. Solidifying the center and preparing for queenside expansion, this move prioritizes pawn structure integrity while allowing bishop development. Establishing a central pawn presence solidifies black's foothold and prepares for further development. Preparing for queenside expansion, white aims to solidify control of the center while reinforcing the king's safety and creating avenues for bishops to join the fray. Establishing a solid knight outpost on d7, this piece now supports a potential e5 push and prepares for central piece redistribution, while simultaneously reinforcing the kingside castled position from potential threats. The castle consolidates white's central influence and prepares to bring the rook into the game, eyeing potential activity on the kingside or even a swift transfer to the queen's flank through the central files. Instantly engaging the center, this pawn thrust creates immediate tension and challenges white's spatial advantage, aiming to shatter the opponent's pawn chain and open lines for a more active piece play. By capturing the pawn, white immediately alters the central pawn structure, potentially opening lines for their bishops and knights while creating a more open game that might favor quicker piece development over slow maneuvering, a scenario black should carefully assess given their king's safety. Opening up the e-file for your rook creates immediate dynamic tension and frees your bishop on g7 to influence the long diagonal, but be mindful of the doubled pawns that can become a target if not supported properly. Relocating the bishop to c2 aims to reinforce the d4 pawn and prepare for a potential queenside expansion, while also offering a clear path for the queen to enter the game on the c-file if needed. Solidifying the central pawn chain is the primary goal here, preparing for a potential Ray 8 and seeking to control the e5 square more effectively. Positioning the queen to support a potential kingside pawn storm while also offering defense for the d-pawn, this move prepares for a central advance or a shift in attacking focus. It creates subtle pressure along the e-file and eyes the weakened squares around black's monarch if castling occurs on the queenside later. This flexible placement allows white to adapt to black's developing plans without immediately committing to a sharp tactical sequence, aiming for a gradual positional advantage. Reconnecting the queen to the central battlefront offers valuable defensive support for the e5 pawn and prepares a potential queenside maneuver, aiming to activate the rook along the d-file or even prepare a timely b6 advance. Seizing central space now becomes the paramount objective, as white boldly pushes forward to challenge black's pawn structure and potentially open lines for rapid development towards the enemy king. Asserting control over the central squares, this knight emerges from its pawn shield, ready to probe weaknesses and potentially disrupt white's kingside slumber. The development to c5 offers a dynamic pawn break threat and simultaneously aims to exert pressure on the d3 bishop. Unleashing the bishop to this active diagonal aims to control the kingside and pressure black's knight, potentially disrupting their coordination, while simultaneously reinforcing the pawn chain and preparing for further central advances. The knight, seeking refuge from the bishop's watchful eye, redirects its energy towards the center, aiming to contest white's advanced pawns and potentially prepare for a central pawn break. Reinforcing the central pawn chain and preparing to contest the d-file, This retreat subtly repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing the queenside while maintaining a defensive post. A knight boldly ventures to the edge of the board, aiming to provoke weaknesses or secure a better outpost on f4, though its initial placement might seem exposed to the kingside pawn storm that could erupt. Bolstering the kingside pawn structure anticipates potential enemy incursions and aims to solidify white's central control, while simultaneously preparing for a potential kingside pawn storm. The knight, now a formidable force at d4, exerts significant pressure, aiming to disrupt white's central control and challenge the bishop on c2, potentially opening lines for black's pieces and preparing for future pawn advances. Liberating the bishop from its diagonal prison immediately addresses the potential awkwardness of the piece, simultaneously challenging black's knight and opening lines for white's own pieces. Opening up the dark-squared bishop's diagonal and reinforcing the center with this pawn capture dramatically alters the pawn structure, creating a clear central outpost for white's knight and potentially loosening black's kingside defense. A curious retreat, the knight seeks refuge on the rim, perhaps aiming for a more active square like c3 via d2, or preparing to reinforce the center if black overextends. Initiating development of the dark-squared bishop to a potent diagonal, this maneuver offers a clear pathway for the bishop to influence the center and potentially create threats against the kingside. Alternative commentary focus, positional compromise. Accepting the pawn deficit to establish active piece play, black deliberately sacrifices material to inject dynamism into the position, aiming to outmaneuver white's more solid but potentially passive setup. Alternative commentary focus, tactical geometry. Creating a powerful battery along the g4-e2 diagonal, the bishop's deployment sets the stage for potential tactical combinations, possibly targeting white's queen or forcing concessions in the pawn structure. Alternative commentary focus, central control. Shifting influence towards the central squares, this move reinforces black's grip on key territory and prepares for further piece mobilization, aiming to disrupt white's intended pawn advances. Alternative commentary focus, piece coordination. Activating the bishop from its passive square, this move seeks to enhance the interplay of black's pieces, contributing to a more cohesive and attacking formation as the game progresses. Shifting the bishop to d3 now is a proactive repositioning, aiming to redeploy this piece to a more active square, potentially on the queenside or even back to c2 to defend the e4 pawn if needed, while simultaneously freeing up the d1 square for the rook. It strategically avoids immediate confrontation with the knight on c5, allowing white to consolidate and prepare for a future pawn push or piece development without overcommitting to a potentially unfavorable exchange. This offers flexibility and allows white to react to black's further plans. Black now centralizes the queen, aiming to bolster the d-pawn's advance and potentially support a knight repositioning to a more active square, like d4, which was vacated by white's bishop exchange. This endeavor seeks to consolidate black's central presence and prepare for further pawn breaks or piece play, subtly shifting the dynamic from a relatively closed position to one with burgeoning possibilities. Rather than passively reinforcing the pawn structure, white prepares to inject dynamism into the queenside by repositioning the knight, aiming to support potential pawn advances like b4 or to simply create a more active outpost for the steed. Black's bishop, now on h3, aggressively eyeballs white's kingside, creating a direct threat against the castled monarch that demands immediate attention and disrupts white's carefully constructed pawn structure. A bold thrust, white ignites the central battleground, sacrificing a pawn to pry open lines and disrupt black's harmonious development. This aggressive advance aims to exploit the exposed king by creating immediate tactical opportunities and potentially isolating black's pieces. It's a gamble, yes, but one that might just shatter black's solid setup if they fail to react precisely. Seeking to disrupt white's queenside structure, this knight bravely ventures into a potentially exposed central square, aiming to provoke weaknesses and open lines for black's beleaguered rooks. Unleashing the queen towards the kingside, white initiates a bold offensive, seeking to exploit black's exposed king and potentially create unstoppable mating threats. Disrupting the pawn chain with that knight sacrifice at d3 injects a fascinating dynamic into the position, creating an open diagonal for your queen and potentially opening up lines towards white's king. However, consider the repercussions. You're relinquishing a powerful outpost for your knight and handing white a free recapture that solidifies their central structure, all while potentially leaving your own king a touch more exposed down the long diagonal. This exchange, while materially balanced, shifts the positional complexion considerably, inviting a sharp, tactical battle where precise calculation will be paramount. Sacrificing the queen to eliminate the dangerous knight on f4 opens up a powerful diagonal for your bishop, potentially pressuring black's undeveloped queenside and even creating threats against the king if it remains castled kingside. The resulting pawn structure will be significantly altered, potentially leading to an endgame where black's isolated d pawn becomes a weakness, or conversely, offering black central pawn control. This aggressive exchange signals a willingness to enter a less concrete, more dynamic phase of the game, where initiative and piece activity will be paramount. Sacrificing the bishop opens a path to the white king, aiming to expose it through pawn storms or knight infiltration, while simultaneously simplifying the position to black's advantage in an endgame where the extra central pawn can become a significant asset. Securing the open file opens up dynamic possibilities against black's uncastled king, aiming to exploit the exposed dark squares in the vicinity. Re-establishing the rook on the open file signals black's intent to contest this crucial central pathway and potentially apply pressure on white's kingside defenses. Re-establishing the open e-file is paramount, offering the rook a vital highway towards the black king's defenses and preparing to contest this crucial central artery. Unleashing a pawn thrust to disrupt the white king's safety, black aims to pry open lines for their pieces and create attacking prospects on the kingside. This capture opens a crucial diagonal for your queen, immediately threatening black's pinned knight and creating immediate tactical opportunities. The removal of the defender allows your rook to become more active and puts pressure on the weakened kingside pawn structure. Consider how this exchange alters the pawn majority dynamics and what that implies for the middle game transition. The rook swap on the e-file simplifies matters, immediately challenging the newly opened route to white's king. Black forces an exchange, aiming to alleviate the queenside pressure and potentially exploit the weakened pawn structure that will emerge after the dust settles. Reclaiming the knight from its temporary outpost on e1, white initiates a consolidation phase, preparing to reinvest the piece into the central struggle and potentially targeting black's now somewhat exposed king on the kingside. Reclaiming material while simultaneously developing the bishop towards the critical central squares, this move aims to activate a piece that has been somewhat passively positioned, seeking to challenge white's currently dominant bishop on c2 and prepare for potential pawn pushes. Asserting control over the center and aiming for kingside expansion becomes paramount, leveraging the newly opened e-file and preparing to redeploy the knight to a more active square. Reactivating the rook to the e-file provides a potent counterpressure, threatening to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially exploit the semi-open nature of the file, aiming for a more dynamic endgame battle rather than passively accepting white's queenside buildup. Securing the monarch's sanctuary by retreating to a safer square on the back rank is a wise tactical adjustment, preparing for potential fireworks on the f-file and allowing the rook to participate more effectively in the ensuing positional battle. Unleashing a tactical lightning bolt, the black queen penetrates the now exposed white king's defenses, disrupting white's carefully constructed piece harmony and creating immediate threats that demand urgent attention. Securing the king from further harassment, white tucks his monarch away from the relentless discovered threats emanating from black's queen and bishop battery. Relocating the queen to square f5 offers a dual threat, pressuring the f3 knight and simultaneously preparing for potential breakthroughs with the rook on the e-file, while also subtly reinforcing the pawn chain. Seizing the open queen file after the exchanges, qb3 aims to pressure black's pawn structure, specifically targeting that potentially vulnerable b7 square, while also offering a retreat from any immediate threats on the d-file and preparing a potential regrouping of white's minor pieces. Strategically, repositioning the rook to the 7th rank aims to activate it along the open file, potentially targeting white's king or weak pawns. Reassuming the king's safe haven on f1 signals a desperate attempt to shore up defenses, a stark contrast to the initiative black has been steadily building. Asserting dominion over the center, this pawn advance seeks to consolidate black's queenside space and potentially open lines for its rooks. Asserting pressure on the queenside, K3* aims to exploit the newly opened diagonal and potentially create threats against black's centralized king, while also preparing to reroute the queen to more active squares, perhaps supporting a pawn push or a knight maneuver. Unleashing the bishop to h4 opens up an intriguing tactical scenario, probing the stability of white's queen and potentially creating weaknesses around the king if it chooses to retreat. Sensing a golden opportunity, the knight lunges forward, aiming to dismantle black's queenside pawn structure and simultaneously open lines towards the exposed black king. This aggressive sortie, while sacrificing material temporarily, seeks to exploit the lingering weaknesses created by black's earlier pawn pushes and gain a decisive initiative. A necessary recapture, though it simplifies the position and enters a potentially sharper endgame where black's unified queenside pawns could become a threat if not carefully managed. Reclaiming central influence, the knight aims to disrupt black's recently established queen-rook battery and potentially fortify white's queenside pawn structure by reiterating pressure on the c-pawn. A startling sortie, the queen pierces the white defenses, exposing the king's precarious position and initiating a potent mating threat. Protecting the king from that devastating discovered check becomes the paramount concern, forcing a slight sidestep to consolidate before the inevitable pawn push. Seizing the initiative on the queenside, this capture directly challenges white's king, introducing immediate tactical complications and disrupting white's pawn structure.